Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Jeff Barnett. Tonight we're going to be taking a tour of the national security globe, and our tour guide is the Honorable Philip J. Crowley. Actually, nobody calls him Philip outside of possibly his dad when he was mad at him. He's P.J. Crowley, and if you talk to anybody from the president through the Clintons out to anybody else in the national security community, they know exactly who P.J. Crowley is. So P.J., welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Jeff, a pleasure to be here.
As I was driving in today, ISIL, Syria, the Kurds was all over the news. It was kind of it was leading the NPR news account. So let's just kind of jump right into this and tell us a little bit about ISIL. You know, what is it, and then tell us why it is of any import to the average American.
These are very, very good questions. The Islamic State, it goes by a variety of terms. The Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
ISIL and ISIS.
ISIL and ISIS. It is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. In fact, ironically, Al-Qaeda threw ISIS off the island, the Al-Qaeda island, some months ago for being too brutal. But they are the latest in a string of extremist groups that are trying to ostensibly, recreate a caliphate in the heart of the Middle East. For us, it comes under the moniker of terrorism, but the Islamic State is somewhat different than some of its predecessors. It has shown the ability to hold territory and to govern that territory. That makes them, say, unique from core Al-Qaeda that was responsible for the attacks of September 11. And so what is also different is the strategy that President Obama is trying to pursue. We've learned many lessons since 9/11. Ultimately, while the United States can be helpful to countries like Iraq, Syria, and the neighborhood in combating, the Islamic State, this is ultimately their fight. It is at its heart a civil war inside of Islam between radical Sunnis and Shia, but this is a very determined. It is a group that will try to eliminate anyone who does not hold their version of Islam, whether they're Christians, other Muslims. I think that over time they will not wear well in the region, but obviously for the moment they have momentum, they have territory, they're holding that territory, and the challenge for the United States is to try to strengthen the ability of the Iraqi government and security forces on the one hand, and then create a viable Syrian opposition that can deal with the Islamic State in the short term and Bashar al-Assad over the long term.
If we could go to, on the slide it's up there now, you can see that it's wearing well in the region right now. Now, some of that's uninhabited territory, albeit. However, this group has resonated among the shopkeepers, the average people in the area, both in Syria and in Iraq. So the question is, why?
It's I don't know that is true. They certainly resonate around the Muslim world with young Muslim males who are drawn to the conflict and drawn to the concept of jihad and identify with the idea of a strict caliphate. I don't think when you talk to the average person in the Islamic world that this is necessarily the kind of society they want to live in, and that's what gives us hope. So I don't know how deep their popularity is. One of the dilemmas, certainly in the context of Iraq right now, is that they are occupying Sunni provinces with at least the tacit support of the Sunni population in Iraq. that look at the Islamic State, look at the Shia-led government in Baghdad, and perversely see the Islamic State as the lesser of two evils. It's that kind of calculation that the United States has to help, but primarily the leaders of Iraq have to change that calculation if we have hope of degrading and ultimately defeating the Islamic State.
Again, why is it in the United States' interest then to degrade and defeat this Islamic State as opposed to any other group in the area?
I think the United States is still trying to understand exactly the nature of the threat that the Islamic State poses to the United States. Obviously, we've seen early this summer the horrific videos of the beheadings of American journalists and British aid workers, and the ability of the Islamic State to draw young people into the conflict, and at some point they go home, whether it's to Europe or in some cases to the United States. And the question, what do they do with that military experience? What do they do with that belief in a caliphate? Do they turn that capability against the United States? Certainly that potential exists. But you're right, we should not overinflate the threat posed by the Islamic State. Primarily right now it is a threat to Iraq, it's a threat to Syria, it's a threat to the region, but certainly there's a potential that it could eventually develop into a threat to Europe and the United States.
But if we're not going to, if we're still kind of uncertain, we're taking some steps that would seem to indicate some degree of certainty. There's been 54 U.S.-led airstrikes against ISIL in the north of Syria over the past 3 days. There's been 3 airdrops of, 27 pallets or containers of medicine, of food, and arms into forces opposing ISIL. So we're getting very involved in this. ISIL is also,
we are directly involved, yep.
I guess, on the outskirts of Baghdad, mortar fire in Abu Ghraib. There's problems up in the oil region of Kirkuk, and the Turks seem to be very concerned. There's a report that the Turks are allowing Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, armed, to cross the border from Turkey into Syria. And I mean, these guys are outlaws within Turkey. Mm-hmm. And so they're letting, this is
very complicated.
Escalating.
It's very complicated. I think the United States strategy right now is to try to use limited military power, air power that you and I have known about, from our previous lives, to stem the momentum of the Islamic State and provide time for the Iraqi security forces to regroup, the Kurdish Peshmerga to strengthen, and then over time see them begin to retake, lost territory within Iraq first, and eventually, within Syria. The president's strategy, as he's declared it, is to degrade and ultimately defeat or destroy the Islamic State. Air power, as you know well, can degrade a military force on the ground, but destroying ISIL would take effective ground forces. The strategy right now is those ground forces should be Iraqi and Syrian, and that's the major question in the strategy. Are they up to this challenge? And the honest answer is we don't know yet.
But the Sunnis in Anbar province, who were key to the Anbar awakening of a couple of years ago, are now, as you say, kind of
on the fence.
Yeah,
and that's where I think the president was right to insist that there be a change in government in Baghdad from Prime Minister Maliki to Prime Minister Abadi. Abadi is saying the right things in terms of becoming more inclusive, governing in ways that invest Sunnis into the modern state of Iraq. That's the political challenge, for Iraq right now, and we'll see if that materializes. If they are effective in doing that, there's every reason to believe that we can see another Anbar awakening just as we did in 2006 and 2007. But that challenge rests first and foremost with the government in Baghdad.
Why don't you go to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit more about Iraq. Iraq, we have 4,500 Americans have died so far in Iraq. An immense amount of national treasure, immense amount of people wounded, and our credibility took a huge hit by our invasion of Iraq. So we are extraordinarily invested in Iraq. Can you kind of give us your opinion as to where's Iraq going and what are we going to be dealing with over the next couple of years?
You know, we tend to look at Iraq in 4-year blocks or 8-year blocks. And yet I think we have to step back and recognize that Iraq has become a strategic country to the United States. The Obama administration is now the 4th consecutive U.S. administration that has been preoccupied with Iraq, going back to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990. Arguably, U.S. presidents have spent more time focused on Iraq than any other country
or any other subject
on earth. And so what we recognize with the situation now is that Iraq is going to be a challenge for the next president of the United States, whoever he or she is, in 2017. So I think we have to recognize we have a long-term challenge that goes back 25 years. And this is something that the United States will need to stay invested in, for the foreseeable future. I mean, if our viewers are thinking back to the structure of the Middle East going back to Sykes-Picot 100 years ago, that structure is under threat. You have questions as to whether Iraq can continue as a viable state, not just choices made by Sunnis in terms of attacking the government in Baghdad, choices made by the Kurds, who have the option of staying as part of an autonomous region, or trying to break off and becoming an own state. You have Kurds who exist in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. So, and these ripple effects can have profound impact on the world and U.S. Policy and interests. So, getting Iraq right can have, very significant regional ramifications.
Who do you listen to? Who do you, when somebody's talking about Iraq, who are the people that, when they talk, you're very interested in what they have to say?
Well, we've had several ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors in the modern state of Iraq. John Negroponte, Chris Hill, Jim Jeffrey, who understand the country, understand the challenge. Those are people that I listen to.
I'm Jeff Barnett. I'm here talking with the Honorable Philip J. Crowley, P.J. Crowley. We're talking about the Mideast, and next we're going to be talking about Israel. So we'll be back in 2 minutes.
Some dreams are universal, dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits. and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett, and this is the Inside Scoop. We're talking with the Honorable P.J. Crowley, former Secretary of State for Public Affairs. He was confirmed by the United States Senate in 2009. You served until 2011. After that, you were a professor at the Army War College, at Penn State University, at Dickinson College, and now you are a fellow at the George Washington University.
All true.
Retired Air Force Colonel. Your last assignment was with the National Security Council.
Also true.
And in all those jobs, we were talking about the Mideast before. We were talking about Syria and Iraq. But in most of these issues, it really comes back down to Israel. Is that right?
It's mostly right. I think one of the changes in the Middle East over the past 3 years, I think go back 40 or 50 years, and the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict is at the heart of the Middle East. It's become a little more complicated in recent years with the so-called Arab uprisings that has preoccupied a lot of states, and then also the rise of Iran in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still on the list. It's still very important. Whether or not it's at the top of the list depends on country by country, but from a U.S. standpoint, it is a major aspect that needs to be solved if you're going to achieve stability and ultimately prosperity in the Middle East.
Well, let me stop you right there. I think that's an interesting insight. So when you're talking about these young men who are joining ISIL and ISIS, as you were saying before, that are flocking to its banner, they're doing so for possibly 3 reasons. One is a reaction to the Western invasion led by the United States of Iraq. Number 2, maybe a backlash to the spirit of the Arab uprising. And then number 3, the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. Is that fair?
In the context of ISIL, I think what drives them is the vision of a caliphate. This is at its heart a war within Islam. Now, as you broaden out from ISIL, in terms of sources of conflict in the Middle East, absolutely. We've had ripple effects, from a variety of challenges across the last several years. What's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Yemen, and what has happened in Iraq. And in terms of ultimately getting stability, in the region, being able to resolve the long-standing conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians is still vitally important. Every Secretary of State, every president, for the last 40 or 50 years has taken a stab at trying to find a solution to that conflict, including the President and present Secretary of State John Kerry.
Yeah. Slide 4, you talked about the caliphate. So is this a caliphate that is focused solely on, yes, slide number 4, that's focused solely on the Levant and Syria, or is this a pan-Arab state that we're talking
about? Well, I think the vision is to recreate the caliphate that last existed during the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, it's impractical. It's not going to happen. So for all intents and purposes, the territory that the Islamic State currently holds in Syria and in Iraq, I don't see that expanding, too significantly, beyond that. And I do think that over time, the region will reject the Islamic State just as it rejected Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2007 and 2008. But this is primarily about what's happening within the Middle East and within Islam. Fortunately, the Islamic State is focused on its own efforts. It hasn't drawn Israel into this particular conflict. It hasn't drawn the United States as of yet into this conflict, but obviously as U.S. efforts continue supporting Iraq and striking the Islamic State in Syria, those calculations could change.
Because I hear a lot of pundits talk about the fear of this pan-Arab caliphate. Are you saying that is simply an overblown prophecy?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to have a vision. I mean, bin Laden had the same vision. He had no mechanism, to carry it out. And the Islamic State has more military capability that it's demonstrated than did Al-Qaeda. But by the same token, understand that they're more than a terrorist group. They are an insurgency. But any effective military of an actual state has the capability to defeat the Islamic State.
Is Iranian support for ISIL, is that critical to its survival, or can it operate without Iranian support?
The Islamic State is a Sunni-led effort, actually directly and through Hezbollah. Iran is fighting the Islamic State. It's weirdly one of the areas of a shared interest, although obviously the United States and Iran are still in an adversarial posture. They're not cooperating. They might be communicating, but they're not cooperating in terms of a shared effort to defeat the Islamic State. But from the Islamic State standpoint, as an Sunni extremist group, they are already responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of Shia.
Well, they have to be getting their support from somebody on a sustained basis. Right now, ISIL has armored Humvees. They have tanks. That requires spare parts. That requires ammunition. It requires support. They all saw about
the difference. The difference is that the Islamic State, in occupying territory, is able to levy taxes, is able to acquire revenue from the smuggling of oil. It has robbed a number of banks, in Iraq, and taken from that millions and millions of dollars. And you're right, they are getting money, from Sunni sympathizers in some of the Gulf states, and that's something that the United States, those governments, are trying to work, to interrupt. So yes, it is a very wealthy insurgent movement, and that's going to give it sustainability, for some time. Although ultimately this is an ideological struggle, and I just don't think that over time the Islamic State's ideology will wear well in the region.
Okay, so let's move back to Israel then. Has been, as you say, the fulcrum for Mideast instability and for United States involvement for our adult lives.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to change?
Well, the U.S. commitment to trying to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question, I think that commitment will continue. But there's a limit to what the United States can do. What's strange about the Israeli-Palestinian situation is both sides know what the solution looks like. But we have not seen the creation of political conditions that enable the kind of compromises that will be necessary to reach an ultimate agreement. The so-called final status issues include, the borders of a Palestinian state. It includes the future status of Jerusalem. Both the Palestinians and Israelis claim Jerusalem as their capital. Very emotionally, it involves a right of return of Palestinian refugees who left traditional Palestine in the late 40s, and a right of return to their homes, or compensation, if they return to a state of Palestine as opposed to the current state of Israel, and acceptance of the region and security of Israel as an accepted part of the Middle East. Those are the core issues. And right now you don't have the political will on either side to incur the compromises necessary to reach an agreement that everyone understands. So it is a political challenge today as much as it's a security challenge.
The two-state solution begins with a Jewish state in Palestine. And you can make all kinds of agreements and compromises on settlements and on rights of return, but if the Arab world is not going to, and if the guy in the street is not going to accept a Jewish state in Palestine, then you're never going to get anywhere with it, are you?
Well, I think most people understand that the state of Israel is there, it's a reality, and it's not going anywhere. And in fact, many people probably envy the relative security and prosperity that exists within Israel.
For both Jews and Arabs.
Yeah, but anyway, I just finished reading 13 Days, Lawrence Wright's book about the Camp David negotiations in the late 70s. But there you see that you have compelling, heartfelt narratives on both sides, and those narratives make it very, very difficult, for someone to give up land, give up an interest, and reach an agreement that ends the conflict. This is something that has been at the heart of people's lives for decades. It's very, very hard, to give up this conflict unless you're assured that on the other side of the treaty there's actually something better. And that's still something that they're struggling to create a vision that people can rally behind, but then gets them to the point where they can make the kinds of compromises that are necessary.
But you're a public affairs professional, so how do you get the average Arab in the street to accept this vision, to accept the reality, the fact that there will be a Jewish state in Palestine?
I think if there's,
that is to their benefit for that to happen.
When I served in the White House during the Clinton administration, we had the push for a peace treaty between the Israelis and Palestinians, and at the same time, a peace process involving, Northern Ireland. And there are some parallels between the two. What enabled Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern, and Bill Clinton to lead the leaders of Northern Ireland to a peace agreement, was ultimately at the tragedy of a place called Omagh in 1998 that changed the politics on the ground, and a dynamic global and regional economy that offered people something better. I think if I were advising Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel today, I would say invest much more in the West Bank in particular, and give them an alternative vision, a reason to move from the political stalemate of today, to a peace treaty and a different life tomorrow.
I wish he'd listen to you. Again, I'm Jeff Barnett. I'm here talking with the Honorable P.J. Crowley. We're talking about Israel and the Mideast. After the break, we're going to move to China and Russia. Stay with us. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
I helped turn my child's public school into a whole new kind of school. One with a curriculum that really motivates kids. One that has extended hours, 6 days a week, year-round. With loads of academic, cultural, and recreational activities. One that has support services like medical and dental right there. A school where parents' involvement is encouraged. Where teachers have more time to teach. And students are excited about learning. There's just one problem. My child doesn't ever want to come home. You can help turn your school into a community school for excellence. Find out how. Call 1-877-LOVE-TO-LEARN.
It's coming. Right to your neighborhood. And when it does, you may be surprised. It's your Social Security statement of your benefits, and it's going to help you plan your financial future. Your benefit statement will tell you how much Social Security you're eligible to receive and when you'll get it. Then you'll know how much you need to save for retirement, because that's coming too. The future is in your hands. Choose to save.
The toxic fumes from this meth lab are seeping into Jamie's sinus cavity. Ammonia vapors invade her throat. Toxic gases fill her lungs. Jamie's body is deteriorating. and she doesn't even know it.
Jamie, dinner.
So, who has the drug problem now? Find out how meth affects you at drugfree.org/.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
This year.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett. We're here talking with the Honorable P.J. Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. We've talked about the Mideast in great detail. We're going to move off of that onto Russia and China, but first we're going to stop a little bit of our tour and with an interim stop in Iran, because Iran, obviously, since 1979, has been a key sore spot for the United States in our foreign policy. And it also has a play in both Russia and with China. So, new President Rouhani in Iran. Where, are you an optimist or you're a pessimist? Where do you think we're going to be in a couple of years with Iran?
Well, let's start by asking where we're going to be in a little bit over 1 month with Iran. In late November, there's a deadline in terms of the current negotiation over Iran's nuclear program and whether we can find a formula that allows the international community to have confidence that Iran is not pursuing an actual nuclear weapon, and from that you would have the relief of some sanctions. Now, Iran has a mix of sanctions that are international and national in the context of the United States. The United States sanctions Iran because of its nuclear ambitions, its violations of its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also its state support of terrorism. So anyone who is afraid that we're going to take the foot off the pedal in terms of Iran, the United States is not going to do that anytime soon.
And there's a lot of people with that foot on the pedal. We're not the only one imposing sanctions.
Yes, and right, that's right. So, but I think both Iran and the United States and something called the P5+1, the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus the European Union, everyone's focused on getting this deal. And the virtue would be, if you can reach a successful negotiation, then you don't have to use military means to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The last thing that we need in the Middle East right now is another conflict, an active conflict. Now, where the relationship goes from that point on is hard to say. As you said, Jeff, there are hardliners in the United States that don't want to compromise with Iran, don't want any kind of a different relationship, and that's also true of Iran. The United States remains the great Satan in the eyes of the Iranian government. So I think that getting the nuclear agreement will be a significant achievement. It'll probably avoid a war. Where we go from there, who knows? I mean, there is a common interest. Iran and the United States both are opposed to the Islamic State. However, Iran supports Bashar al-Assad. The United States does not. So there's a narrow interest, but then a serious conflict. In Afghanistan, the United States and Iran have a shared interest in a stable Afghanistan, which rests on the other border that Iran has. So there will be opportunities to cooperate, but I think that this is a decade-long process where you'll have inch by inch see what potential exists in a different kind of relationship between the United States and Iran.
Yeah, you raised the specter of the hardliners within the United States. Arthur Vandenberg, the great senator back in the 1950s, I think, said that foreign affairs or politics stops at the water's edge, I think was his.
Never has.
Well,
it was a good line, but I don't think it ever has.
But today, you're right. I think the president, Secretary of State, their hands are constrained as to what they can do with Iran, right?
Well,
so it's not just what Iran's going to do; it's what we can kind of live with.
There are competing political narratives in the United States. This president has decided to engage Iran, find out what's possible. I happen to support that approach. There are others who equate engagement with appeasement. It's not the case. I mean, during the heart of the Cold War, as you remember well, we talked to the Soviet Union all the time. If we can talk to the Soviet Union, and as horrific as their human rights record is, we can talk to Iran in our mutual interest and see what's possible and see if there are ways of reducing tension. But I just don't see that the basic nature of the relationship and the antagonism that has built up over decades between the United States and Iran is going to dissipate anytime soon.
Okay. You mentioned the Cold War, you mentioned kind of the Soviet Union, so now let's move on to Russia. Russia lives in a tough neighborhood, and it's got some tough strategic problems. Its population is declining, and it's supposed to decline by another 10%, I think, over the next 15 years. Its borders, a lot of the people that we consider are problem children. It borders North Korea, it borders China, it borders Iran. It has made its own problems with places like Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So, where's Russia going? What do they want, or are they still in the throes of lashing out?
Well, I wouldn't say that this is a return to the Cold War. You know, we remember well serving at the Pentagon and assuming that there were a healthy number of Soviet missiles targeted at the place where we ate lunch in the courtyard of the Pentagon.
We called it Ground Zero.
Yeah, right, exactly right. Mm-hmm. This is a different era. It's a different relationship. I think under Vladimir Putin, he's having fun being the chief antagonist in chief to Barack Obama. He's able to parry, but he's not able to actually advance his country. Russia is, as the president said, at best a regional power. It's declining power. You add to it its economy; it rests on one pillar, extractive energy, and the fact that we have fuel prices declining rapidly is good for us as citizens. It's also good for our strategic interests in terms of pulling money out of Vladimir Putin's pocketbook. And I think that's, he's trying to destabilize Ukraine. He saw a year or so ago a political movement in Ukraine that was moving beyond his comfort level. He's reasserted Russian hegemony over Ukraine's future. We're right to decry that, but we shouldn't overestimate what that represents.
You're right about oil prices. They've gone down by 20% just since July. But Putin seems to resonate with the average Ivan in the street.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Putin is very popular at home. The plays that he's made reacquiring Crimea, which Russia had given to Ukraine under Khrushchev, is very popular at home. But still, on the international stage, we should understand the problems that Putin is creating. They are serious problems in terms of stability in Europe. There's actually an opportunity here over the next 10 years. If the United States and Europe work cooperatively, we can take the energy resources that we are acquiring in abundance in this country and use them to help Europe disengage, remove some of the leverage that Russia has. For a number of European countries, they get 100% of their energy from Russia. That needs to change. Let market forces work in Europe so that you reduce Russia's leverage, reduce their ability to use energy as a weapon, and hopefully that, with the reduction of Putin's pocketbook, will potentially, as the president says, change his calculations.
But Russia being a basket case is not in anybody's interest. 5,000 nuclear warheads, 12 time zones. I mean, we don't want to see Russia become as, obviously, I'm not saying as unstable as Syria. I'm just saying we don't want to see an unstable Russia either.
Well, I mean, we've had political debates in this country where people say, well, the American power is in decline. That's a very nuanced statement. The United States remains the most influential country in the world. Right. That's not going to change. Russia and China are trying to position themselves where they can try to blunt some of the American influence, but they're not going to fundamentally try to replace the United States, and they're not in a position to necessarily to work that cooperatively as a balancer to the United States. We need to engage Russia, and we have the opportunity to cooperate in areas of mutual interest. Iran is one of those. And with China, we have the opportunity to help China develop as a global power. Some of the major concerns for the United States, for example, climate change, can't be solved without effective action by China. So we need to find areas where we can cooperate and then manage areas where we know there are going to be tensions in both relationships.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about China. You said China as a global power. Does the United States, is it in our interest for China to take a global leadership role?
It has been U.S. policy, going back to Nixon and his opening, with China in 1972. It is in the interest of the United States and others to bring China into the system, have a role in setting the rules of the road, and then heeding, the rules of the road. Obviously, and China, there are two competing narratives here. The United States sees China as a rising power. China still sees itself as a developing nation. But clearly, particularly in the region, China has become more assertive, and that has actually worked to the advantage of the United States. China has tried to bully many of its neighbors in a number of territorial disputes that exist with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, and these countries are inviting the United States back into the region in a robust way, to try to help them as a balance, to a more assertive China. There are tensions in this relationship, but I think always it's a matter of perspective. Is the U.S.-China relationship stronger than it was 5 years ago? Probably not. Is it stronger than it was 25 years ago? It's been revolutionized over the past 25 years. That's basically good news, but obviously there are some serious areas where there are disagreements, but obviously because of among other things, the interconnections in our economy, there's a very significant shared interest. It's a much deeper, much more robust, much different relationship than it was, say, back in the early 90s.
We have about a minute before the next break. Let's just talk just a little bit, though. Tell us, why does the United States have a dog in that fight between, let's say, a territorial dispute between the Philippines and China? I mean, people are going to fight. So why do we have to invest our people and our treasure?
Well, the United States is very concerned and wants to see all of these disputes resolved peacefully and resolved within either bilaterally or through multilateral institutions. The United States, there's no interest from the United States in seeing any of these conflicts develop from tension into something larger. But the United States is an Asia-Pacific region. Our economy is rooted in trade to Asia. The United States does a great deal to secure the global commons in Asia, so it's in our interest to make sure that it is stable, prosperous, that serves the United States' interest over the long run.
I'm Jeff Barnett. We're here talking with PJ Crowley. We're taking a tour of the world. Be back in 2 minutes.
This year, 28,000 Americans will be diagnosed with oral cancer. Every year, 7,000 Americans die of oral cancer.
I'm Eva Cohen, and I'm an oral cancer survivor. I didn't fit the profile. I didn't smoke or drink. I had no family history of cancer, no family history of cancer. I was 31 years old. 31 years old. I went to see my dentist about a sore in my mouth that wouldn't heal. It was oral cancer. I had to have a radical neck dissection and a portion of my tongue reconstructed. I didn't know if I was going to live or die.
I'm Surgeon General Richard Carmona. The survival rate for oral cancer is only 50%. Oral cancer can happen to anyone. If you have a sore or lesion in your mouth that doesn't heal within 2 weeks, see your dentist. Early detection is the key.
Early detection saves lives. I know.
1 in 8 Americans goes hungry. One idea helped change that. A community started a garden that blossomed into farmers markets. 1 in 6 children lives in poverty. One group of women found an answer by opening a daycare center that their neighbors could afford. Today, 36 million Americans live in poverty, but one by one, people are helping themselves and each other to change the picture of poverty to one of hope. For easy ways you can help, visit povertyusa.org.
2 words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett. Thanks for joining us. Again, I'm talking with the Honorable P.J. Crowley, former Secretary of State for Public Affairs, and we have taken a tour of the world. We've talked about the Mideast, we've talked about China, Russia, Iran. Now let's kind of bring it back more to the homeland. But let's start off with defense spending. Defense spending, the United States obviously outclasses the world. We spend, 5 times as much as China. We spend twice as much as the rest of NATO combined on defense. And by most counts, we spend about half of the whole world's defense military spending is American dollars. So here we are, we're trying to balance our budget. Is that level of spending sustainable?
I mean, as a practical matter, as a percentage of GDP, yes. We are spending a lot on our defense, but by the same token, our economy has grown and our tax base has grown. So the relative burden is not necessarily out of whack with where it's been before. But we seldom ask ourselves another question related to the defense budget, which is, we have the finest military in the world. You and I served in it, and we want to retain that capability.
Actually, it's much better now than when I was serving.
However, having a strong military to do what? And this is where President Obama, in an interview with 60 Minutes a few days ago, said, when there's a world crisis, people call the United States. They don't call Beijing, they don't call Moscow, and we have had situations pop up like we're experiencing now in Iraq and Syria, where we need the United States military to take effective action. So these kinds of situations are always going to develop. I would say that we tend, particularly in political circles, we define being strong on defense as plowing more money into the military instrument of American power. And yet it's only one dimension.
Right.
Solving some of these problems will require military action, but then military action working in concert with diplomatic initiatives and development programs. We are focused more since 9/11 on homeland security, and as we do come off the offensive, ending the war in Afghanistan this year, the question is, are we taking resources and strengthening our security at home? Because defense now will become more important. So we've got to change the politics of national security. Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, said, if I had an extra dollar, I wouldn't invest it in the Pentagon. I'd invest it in the State Department. The Pentagon's budget, give or take, is $600 billion a year. The State Department's budget, give or take, is $50 billion a year. The Homeland Security budget, give or take, is $45 billion a year. That's a lot of money, but we need to make sure that we are investing in all instruments of national power going forward, not just one.
I was struck by the fact that in response to the Ebola crisis, particularly in Sierra Leone, the U.S. Department of Defense is taking a leadership role in it. And so nation building has become a a task for DOD. And responding to healthcare crises is becoming a task for DOD, or no?
Well, no. I mean, yes and no. I mean, it ought to be a task for other civilian agencies, who can do that better and over a longer period of time. The DOD response in Liberia is an emergency response, but this demonstrates how in an interconnected world, what happens somewhere else can affect our security. A weakness somewhere else can affect our security. I know a lot of Americans think that foreign aid, is a waste of money, and they think that we spend far more on foreign aid than we do. It's less than 1% of the federal budget. And yet we get a lot of bang for that buck. But if we're going to address challenges like Ebola, we're going to have to invest in societies that are coming out of conflict, like Liberia, like Cote d'Ivoire, that have solved civil wars fairly recently, but still have weak institutions of government, including weak public health sectors. It is in our interest to invest in those countries, strengthen those institutions so they can handle more of these kinds of crises there without having the ripple effects come towards the United States to a significant degree.
But it may be in our interest, but it's also a cost. And we are, again, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs about 4 years ago said that, Admiral Mullen said that the number one threat facing America is debt. So at what point do we address our own debt issues and let these other crises around the world find their own level?
Well, that's a dilemma. I mean, ultimately, we, as part of this great debt debate that we're having as a country, it's a false debate. We haven't yet answered the fundamental question: what do you want government to do on your behalf? And for those who want to cut government spending, what does government currently do that you think it should not do? Our leaders in Congress, argue about these issues, but haven't necessarily come up with realistic answers. But obviously, I think one area where people, do agree is we should invest in the security of the United States. Now, people have to recognize that the dimension, what we call security or national security, is changing. It's evolving. It's not just about armies. In fact, I don't think that we probably, relative in our lives, we face the lowest risk of an attack by a foreign army that we've had in our lifetimes, that separate from the issue of terrorism. Risk now comes in different forms. It comes with an Ebola virus. It comes with an avian flu tied to global food chains, of which we rely on other countries and their standards, for our food security. And all of us are now connected to the intranet, and we see challenges, of cybersecurity. In some cases, state-sponsored. In some cases, by international criminal organizations. Those all affect our national security. Now, in the area of cybersecurity, much of that can be done by the private sector, but the government has an essential role in terms of setting standards, increasing its ability to understand these threats through better intelligence, and deal with that on the international scene. So we have to recognize that security is an evolving phenomenon and make sure that we are equipped to handle this full range of challenges. In some cases we are, but as we're finding out in our response to the Ebola crisis, it's better than people are giving it credit for, but obviously there are areas where we still have weakness that we have to strengthen.
The bit about better than people give it credit for, it seems to me that the response has been very good, that CDC and others have stepped up very well. But there's a standard that seems not to have been met, that people have in their minds. So, are there any specific steps do you think that the administration will be taking in the near term that go beyond emergency response to more formalize this problem with infectious diseases?
Many of the challenges that the administration has faced is in the area of public messaging. Some of the statements that the president's made and others have made have been too categorical. It won't happen here. Well, it did happen here. And we're prepared to handle it. Well, we have been generally, but there have been some weaknesses. Not all of this, government has to lead, but some of this is effective action at the state level, at the local level, in the private sector, since obviously, as we've seen in the case of Dallas, this was a private hospital that did many things right, but not everything right, and obviously 2 of its own health workers have now have Ebola as a consequence. I think in terms of raising our level of preparedness for a range of challenges is an essential thing. In the Homeland Security realm, we hear about the term resilience. Right. Not necessarily understanding exactly what a threat is going to look like, but having capabilities at the national and local level to deal with whatever comes across our path. That is, we have many systems that are effective. We have some systems and capabilities that are brittle, or there are imbalances where there are strong capabilities here, weaknesses here. We have to try to level that out over time, and that will require government investment to achieve.
Yeah, almost like the body has the ability to rapidly respond to ward off a virus or to deal with the virus, but it doesn't have, it's not as though it's never going to be infected. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Cybersecurity, you just mentioned that. We had a recent thing where the director of the FBI is having some real problems with Apple and Google. Eric Holder has said, what would we have done if Osama bin Laden had an iPhone? He might still be alive. Where are we going with cybersecurity? Again, we have about 2 minutes left.
Well, I mean, there's an area called cybersecurity, and also the area of intelligence collection. We have 2 competing narratives, it seems to me, in our society. The narrative that Edward Snowden advanced over the last year was government's been doing too much. The narrative that we had emerge immediately after 9/11 was the government didn't do enough. You had the triple failures of failure of intelligence, failure to connect the dots, failure of imagination. Again, the American people have to decide how much privacy they are willing to give up for how much security. I think government, now that we're well past the emergency state of this, government has to be more transparent. It has to level the American people. Here's what we're doing in basic terms. Here's why. Here's how it affects you. And what Edward Snowden has done primarily is undercut the trust that people have in government, and that includes important institutions in our lives, like Apple, Google, and other technology companies who are trying to run their own global business, and now are confronting a competitive headwind where they're trying to sell material to a European country and they think the National Security Agency is right behind them. I think we have to have a far more robust conversation, a calm conversation, outside of the political rhetoric, and then make these informed decisions. What do we want government to do, and what does it cost, and what are we willing to cede to government as part of that bargain?
P.J. Crowley, it has been a pleasure to have you here on the show. We have covered a wide variety of issues, and I had a whole list of things that we still didn't get to. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Pleasure, Jeff.
And thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed our time with P.J. Crowley. Good night.